Hi, I'm Beth Rooney, and I am a real estate agent with EXP, and I am here to talk to you about the new NAR regulations and how that is going to affect sellers. So I've done a different video on how the new regulations starting on August 17th of 2024 will affect buyers. And today's video is going to be about how this will affect sellers. These changes are going to affect sellers, buyers, agents, investors, everybody, and they're national changes. So I thought in this video I would take a minute to explain how real estate compensation worked up until August 17th and then what the changes will be going forward. I'll mention some of the changes for buyers because it will affect you as a seller as well. So how did commissions used to get paid, or how are they getting paid until the next week or so? Typically, when you go to sell your house, you would, and you wanted to hire an agent, you and that agent would negotiate on a overall compensation plan. And that compensation plan would spell out how much the listing agent or listing company was going to get, and how much, if there was another agent representing a buyer, how much they would get. And so I'm just going to give you an example. It was always able to be negotiated, but let's just say that total compensation was 6%, meaning there was a 6% fee for the service of hiring an agent to sell your home. That listing company would then offer on MLS a percentage of that based on the agreement that you made with them as a seller on MLS as to how much they were going to be offering out. So in my example, the total fee might have been 6%, and they may have offered out 2.5% or 3% on the MLS to any buyer that procured the sale with any buyer's agent, that procured a sale for their buyer. And so if a buyer's agent was a member of the MLS and they were the procuring cause on that case, it was a unilateral offer of compensation to any buyer agent that consummated that sale and procured the buyer. And so how the mechanics of it would work is typically that the listing company would hold the escrow deposits in an escrow account and then apply those dollars toward the total fee, and they would pay out themselves as a listing company and the co-broke, the buyer's agent's company. Now, sometimes they had more money in escrow than they needed, so the reserve would go back to the seller, and sometimes they needed to collect more money at the closing to satisfy the agreement that the seller made with the listing company. I hope that's pretty clear. And that's the way it's been done for many, many years. Now, what happens if a buyer came along that did not have an agent or had no representation? Well, typically the listing agent would, unless previously agreed upon with the seller, they would get the what we would call both sides. So in that case, the listing agent would not be representing the buyer, or possibly could be representing the buyer if they had dual agency. And in that case, they would be either representing just the seller but writing the offer for the buyer, and the buyer would essentially be unrepresented, or they could be what would be called a dual agency. They would have to have permission to do that from both parties before that, and then they'd have to disclose that that's what they were doing, and then they became sort of a neutral party. But in that case, typically, they would get the full amount or some other percentage that was previously agreed upon in the offer, in the listing contract. So that's how it's worked. The majority of the sales in the markets that I've managed in Greater Boston were co-broke sales, meaning that you had one party representing the seller and another party representing the buyer. I would say, I don't know the exact number, but in my, just looking back in my career, I'd probably say north of 80%. Sometimes listing agent had both sides, and sometimes they didn't. Most of the time, or I'd say even 90% of the time, there was a co-broke. It was less common by far to have a listing agent representing both sides. But anyways, so what's changed? So that's how it worked for many, many years. So what has changed? Well, the biggest change in that scenario is that the listing agent can no longer advertise on the MLS what that the compensation to a buyer's agent is. So does that mean a seller cannot offer compensation to a buyer's agent? No, they can offer it, but they cannot advertise it on MLS. So there's some other changes there too. Something that's really affecting the buyers that's different, that's a big change, is, you know, listing agents and sellers have worked under contract for many, many years, decades. A buyer could have a buyer's agent, so to speak, without having a contract. They were encouraged to have a contract. As a manager, I was always encouraging my agents to have an agreed upon contract up front, just like they did with their sellers, but in practice it didn't happen very much. Going forward, as of August 17th, if a buyer is going to work with a buyer's agent, they have to have a written contract. And you can see my other YouTube video on what that all means. But how that affects a seller is that a buyer now has a contract with a buyer's agent, that now they are on the hook, so to speak, for their compensation. So where does that compensation come from? Well, it could come from really one of three ways with some variations within there. You as a seller can 100% still say, yes, I'm willing to offer compensation as an incentive to buyer's agents to bring me their buyers. These buyers tend to be, well educated, they've been vetted, they've been pre-approved, etc. So there's a lot of benefit to a seller to say, yes, I'd like to incent that pool of buyers and buyer's agents to come to my house and make an offer. And you could offer a specific dollar amount or percentage upfront. All of this is negotiable. Your listing agent just cannot advertise that on MLS. So they can tell them on the phone. There's other ways they can do it, but they cannot advertise it in the MLS. Now, the other option could be that the buyer, when they make an offer to you, ask you for what would be called a seller concession. So they could say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I know or I don't know, we haven't heard if you're offering compensation or not to buyer's agents, but I'd like a concession at closing. I'd like you to say, take X amount of dollars and put it towards my my part of the ledger, and I can use that to satisfy my buyer agent fee. I could put it towards maybe a roof that needs to be repaired. I could use that money to buy down some closing cost points and reduce my my interest rate on my loan. They're just asking you for a concession, and they're going to decide how they use that concession. So that is a second way to do it. A third way could be that the buyer specifically asks the seller to pay their agent on their behalf at the time of closing. So as opposed to having it go from the seller to the buyer and the buyer to the buyer agent, it would go directly from the seller to the buyer agent's company. When I say buyer agent, I always mean their company. Same thing with listing agents. It's really the company that's getting paid, and then they turn around and pay the agent. So that's an option. The fourth option is that the buyer is paying the buyer's agent out of their pocket, separate from the transaction. So that's always been an available option for things like for sale by owners, or if there's, again, the offer of compensation on MLS didn't satisfy the buyer agent fee. That's always been an option. Most of these things have always been options, and they've definitely all been negotiable. But the mechanics of them are certainly changing, and the transparency to buyers on how their agents are getting paid is now very, very transparent, which is, I think, a really great thing. I think buyers had no idea how their buyers agents were getting paid, or what they got paid, or who in how that all kind of worked. It was always kind of a mystery, I think, to many buyers. So I hope that makes it clear. So you as a seller can still offer compensation to buyer agents up front. You can say, okay, anybody that brings me a buyer, I'm gonna offer them a percentage of XYZ, I'm gonna offer them a flat fee. You can tell your listing agent that, and you can ask your listing agent to share that anywhere other than the MLS. You can say, let's see, bring me an offer, and if your offer is strong and you wanna write in that I'm gonna pay your agent, put it in there. Because you're gonna really then be looking at your net offer, okay? So your net offer is the offer minus any expenses that you have, like your listing agent fee, perhaps the fee that the buyer has asked you to pay on their behalf, or perhaps a concession they've asked you. And all of those things could be negotiated at the time of the offer. So it's a change for sure. It's a moving target a little bit, and it's different. It's some companies are handling it a little bit differently. So, for example, the company I work for, EXP, they are no longer going to be the middleman. Even though you could be the person that it could still mechanically work that a listing company holds the money and pays the buyer agent's firm on the behalf of the seller. That can still work that way. Some companies are saying, we're gonna opt out of that because there's been so many lawsuits and it's a gray area and we don't wanna be part of that. That doesn't mean that they're not suggesting or endorsing that at times it makes a lot of sense for a seller to offer incentive to a buyer's agent. They're just not gonna be the middleman anymore. They're not gonna say, okay, you pay us and we'll pay them. They're saying, you're gonna have an agreement that's gonna spell that out directly with either the buyer or with the buyer's broker. But we're not gonna be part of that. We're gonna say, here's our fee, here's what you're paying us for, and if you wanna offer compensation to buyers agents, that's great, we'll let them know, but that compensation is not gonna run through us as it has in the past. I am more than happy to answer questions, to hop on a call, to do some strategy conversations. This is going to hit different in different markets based on if it's a seller's market, a buyer's market, I believe. It's a new world, it's a new way of doing business, so there'll be some bumps in the road. What I can say is I'm gonna share my screen here. I really am happy with the agreements that EXP has put in place. This is an exclusive authorization and right to sell, so it's basically a listing agreement. I feel like they've done a really nice job making this really, really clear as to what the compensation is. It's not full of legalese, it's easy to understand. It spells out what the listing broker compensation is, what the compensation will be if there's an unrepresented buyer. It will talk about that this is not fixed, it's all negotiable. It talks about how you maybe ask for seller concessions. And then it tells you what our role as a listing agent will be to do, how we will show and access the property. It tells you about our service. It asks sellers for their commitment, and it's pretty straightforward. It's just some of these other terms are part of every other listing agreement I've ever seen, and you sign it. Right now, we also have an amendment to our agreements for any sellers who signed an agreement prior to August 17th, their house is on the market. Now that advertisement of compensation can no longer be made on the MLSs. So we have an addendum for that as well. So again, my name is Beth Rooney. I've been in this business for a long time. I feel like I have a good handle on these changes, and I would be more than happy if you're thinking about selling to hop on a call or come over and see you, explain this in person, answer questions, and help you to understand what your best strategy is based on the market you're in, the price range you're in, what you're trying to accomplish, and all that kind of great stuff. So thank you, and reach out with any questions.